Hi everyone, I'm Sophia from New Day by Sophia. Thanks for joining me today. Today we are going to make a fitted beanie, and it's going to have a folded brim as well. The way that we're going to make this toque is we are going to measure out our head first, do some very simple calculations, and math is not my strong suit, so I just want to let you know that we're going to walk through that step by step, make sure that you have the right measurements, and then we're going to cut our foam resist and we can go from there. So we're going to start off with the measuring tape. I just have this little one here that I like. It's nice and thin, so it's easy to wrap around our head. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to measure out the width of our head. And the way that you measure out your width is you're going to, I'm going to put my thumb at the 0 mark, and then I'm going to start off from the back and go all the way around, and I'm going to see where it ends off at. And that's 22 inches, so I've written down 22 inches width. And then for length depends. And because we're making a felted brim toque, and we're going to be folding that brim over, we're going to want to measure the height of the toque a little bit longer. So I'm going to take my measuring tape again. Rather than starting off at the middle of my ear, which is what I would normally recommend, I'm going to just go a little bit further and go to the bottom of my ear from side to side. And then I'm going to take that measurement, which is 17. So I've written down 17 length. And we're going to go from there. So those are your two most important numbers for your measurements. Make sure that you write them down first. And now we're going to go through the calculation, since your toque is going to end up shrinking during the felting and fulling process. For the simplicity of this project, I've assumed a 35% shrinkage rate. So I've written down 35% shrinkage rate, and the number that we actually need is going to be 1 minus the shrinkage rate to get 0.65. So the magic number that we're going to use is 0.65. Of course, if you've had experience with your wool and it has a higher shrinkage rate than 35% and you're leaning towards using a 40%, then feel free to plug that number in instead. So we're going to take our important number, move it down here, 22 inches, which is the width around my head, divided by 0.65 is equal to, now let's see here, I've got 22 inches divided by 0.65 is equal to 33.8. So I'm going to round that up to 34. And then we're going to divide that by 2, and we get 17 inches. Again, 17 inches is going to be the width of our foam resist. And it's going to make more sense once I show you the foam resist. The reason why we've divided this by 2 is because we're working with a 2D object. We're not working with a sphere head in this project. So we're dividing it by 2 because we don't actually need the full length from what we measured around. We're just using half of that. We will be flipping the resist over, and so that's essentially the other half of the length that you'll be felting over. And we're going to do the exact same thing for our length here. So I had 17 inches divided by 0.65 equals, I've got 26. So we'll get 13 for the length. And I'm just going to write this out here so that I know what I'm going to be using for my resist. Perfect. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do those calculations, and we're going to meet back with our foam. So I've gone ahead and set up my table now. What I have on the bottom layer is I have an old towel, I have some soft bubble wrap on top of that. So this I just grabbed from an Amazon package that came in over Christmas. I have some painter's plastic placed on top, and then my foam that I've cut. And of course you're going to want to have another piece of plastic sitting close by. One of the tips that I've learned is the painter's plastic and the bubble wrap comes in big sheets. It's so much easier to work with smaller pieces of plastic and not have tons of plastic covering your work surface. The closer you can cut your plastic and bubble wrap to your resist size, of course leaving a couple inches around the edges because there will be some wool coming off the edges here. It's just gonna be a lot easier to work with smaller amounts. The next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my merino wool. So I have 2 bundles here. Something that I learned from a supplier and teacher called Living Felt is it's really nice to pull these apart in 1/8 and then place them on your resist to see an approximate amount of wool that you're going to use. I don't measure my wool, but I think that that is quite important too if you're making something very professional. And one day I probably will start measuring it, but for now, while I'm making so many different projects and not really repeating them, I don't really mind just kind of eyeballing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this wool in half first. We're going to want to make sure that it is unraveled and not twisted at all, or else that is going to be harder to pull that apart. I believe I bought this wool from Divinity Fibers. They're out east, I think in Quebec, and they have some great products, and I love this color. It's just a very natural tan color. So I'm going to go ahead and split this in half. I'm going to break these up into about a foot. Now we have our separated wool here. And the trick that I wanted to show you is if you just wrap it around like this, we're going to actually fill our hat up with this. And then we're going to count how many bundles we have, and we're going to set aside the same amount of bundles for the other side so that we can ensure that we have the same amount of wool on both sides of the hat, because we don't really want one side of our hat to be thicker than the other. Okay, now that we have everything separated more or less into equal piles, we're going to start. So there's a certain technique that I learned when laying out the wool, and I'm going to draw it up first. I'm a very visual learner, so I like to see how this is going to look. So I'm going to draw out my tube resist here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to lay out the wool around the perimeter. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to lay it out straight like this. It should go about 1 inch over the edge. Now when we get to the base, all you're going to do is you're going to lay your wool straight across this way. This doesn't actually need to go over the edge because we won't be folding it over. So again, you'll just lay it straight out all the way around. And then when we get to the middle of your tube, we are going to make it a herringbone technique. And what a herringbone looks like is you're gonna go like this in one direction, and then again like this. And what this does is it's a really good technique to not have any gaps or holes in your wool. Now we're doing the herringbone technique. So I'm going to go diagonal one way. And don't worry if there's some thin areas. We're going to go back and cover those up with more wool. We just want to make sure that there's an even amount. So now that I'm done covering the surface, I'm just going to feel with my hands and look to see if there's any areas that need some extra wool. We want to make sure that the resist beneath this is completely covered before we do our third layer, which we'll come back to. Okay, we finally reached the felting stage. So I've got a bowl with warm water. It's not hot or boiled or anything. We don't want to shock the wool too much with super hot water. I've also got a sponge. I've got a brass ball. I've also got some lavender oil soap that I have. And this is just really good quality soap. It has a good pH level for
the wool so it doesn't get too sudsy. What soap and warm water does is it actually opens up the scales of the wool and it allows it to start felting, or in other words, interlocking with other pieces of fiber around it. I'm gonna take my lavender soap and I'm gonna put it in my bucket, and I'm gonna let this soap. So before we get started, you're also going to want to have a netting nearby. I've seen people use polyester curtains to lay on because wool does not felt with synthetic fibers such as polyester. So I'm pretty sure that's what this is made of. Another option, rather than using the brass ball, is you can use a sponge to soak the water onto your hat, and that also gives you a bit more control with the amount of water that you have on the table. So let's go ahead and take our sponge, and I'm gonna start from the middle and then go outwards. Again, Living Felt was my inspiration for this tutorial. They did a looser fitting beanie and it was really nice too. I like a slightly different style, which is why I wanted to do the length a bit longer and also have it fitted. So it really depends the type of toque that you're wanting to make. But the great thing with hats, and of course felting hats, is you have a lot of freedom with what you're making. So I'm just using as much water as I need, and I'm making sure that I don't soak the perimeter, but I'm getting pretty close to it because I don't want any wool that hasn't been soaked in the middle. I'm just going to use my hands now just to make sure that it is soaked all the way through. We don't want any air pockets because that just means that there's going to be wool that isn't felting. I also like to lift this up a little bit and wet my fingers and just give this a little tuck in. We don't really need the felt at the brim to be frayed at all, so I'm just going to tuck that in. And from here we can very carefully peel off our netting. You are going to have fibers, especially the dry ones and the wet too. Try to stick to this netting, but it wouldn't have felted through. So there may be a little bit of migration, and that's totally normal. Okay, so now that that's done, we're going to lay our plastic on top and we're going to flip it, and then we're just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So we'll lay this down. I'm going to not lift up the bubble wrap, but I am going to lift up the plastic beneath it, and I'm just going to flip it over like this. We want to make sure that it's nice and tight around the perimeter, because that's how we measured our head, so we're going to want to make sure that it fits. Now from here, we're just going to do the exact same thing that we did at the beginning. So I'm going to take my wool, I'm going to put it around the perimeter, and then we're going to do the fishbone. So now that we're done covering our surface, we're going to go back, feel the surface, and make sure that there aren't any gaps or holes in here, and we can add little bits of wool to cover those up. Okay, so we'll grab our netting again, our sponge and our warm water, and we'll start in the middle. Now that that's done, we can peel off our netting very carefully. We'll put our plastic back over. do our flip. And we've got one last layer to do on each side. It's just a vertical layer. We're not gonna have to do the herringbone again. That's just to cover our surface to make sure there's no gaps or holes or anything. So we're just gonna do some thin wisps of vertical. And this again is just to ensure that we don't have any gaps. And this time we don't actually have anything coming off of the edges. There may be some wool coming off the edges, just not intentionally, but that's okay. We'll just have to fold those over. Now we're going to do the net. Soak and soak. I'm going to use quite a bit more than I was using before because I've noticed that this wool is a bit coarser than what I had used in the previous hat, which was 19, and I have a feeling that this may be a Cordale. Seems like it might be 22 microns. It's going to take me a bit longer to shrink, so I would recommend going with a 19 micron if you're wanting it to shrink at a 40% shrinkage rate. I'm not going to add too much to the brim here because I am realizing that it's going to be folded over, so I'm not too worried about that. But I have added the rest of my wool down. I'm going to add my netting. This is the exciting part. We've laid down all of our wool, we've wet it, we've soaked it, and this is what the felting stage is. So this is really, the felting stage is over, and we want to start with the fulling stage. So the fibers are really going to start to interlock. We're going to see some shrinkage happening, and that is going to take a bit of time to shrink this to the rate that we wanted it to shrink to, which was 35%. And so I'm going to start off with a pool noodle. This is a softer foam, and I do have the softer bubble wrap that this is laying on as well, just above my towel. And then once we start fulling this a little bit more, I'm going to switch over to my PVC pipe that I have left over from a renovation, and then we're going to roll it with that on the harder bubbles. So the trick with rolling is that we want to make sure that we're moving our hat around so that we're felting it. If we're rolling it this side first from left to right, then we're going to want to unroll it and roll it the same number of times from right to left. Again, there's not a perfect science or method to this, but we're trying to get even shrinkage all around this toque. So we're going to want to pay a bit of attention to that type of thing. So I'm actually going to keep the netting on top for now when I roll this up with my first go, because I want to make sure that all my fibers are staying intact.